delighted to I am delighted to introduce Catherine Sheard. Catherine Sheard did her undergraduate degree in mathematics and ecology and evolutionary biology at Yale. She then went and did a DPhil in zoology, which, I mean, for those of you who don't know, a DPhil is basically a PhD, but from Oxford. They have to have a special name, I guess. And then she did a postdoc with Kevin Leyland in St Andrews, and is now runs the cleverly named Sheard Lab at the University of Aberdeen, which it turns out is a great place to live. I learned last week that Aberdeen is apparently recently voted the best place to live in Britain. So congratulations. But I'm really excited to have Catherine here because she does such sort of interdisciplinary work. I think your job title is Interdisciplinary Fellow, right? Which appears to be an extremely accurate term. So you do work on, based on your website and based on what I know about the work you've done before, but I think you say you work mostly on birds and mammals, but also fish, spiders, and human languages, which is I feel a very SCEW and a very MindCORE set of things. So I think this is going to be really interesting. So thank you, Catherine.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I should also say that the Sheard Lab is literally just me at the moment because I am brand new faculty. Right. So, okay. My name is Catherine Sheard. I'm, as I just said, brand new faculty at the University of Aberdeen. And I'm going to talk to you today about phylogenetic trees. Slide maybe advances. Oh, no. Probably click from there on. Amazing. Okay. So setting expectations, I am setting the tone by opening with a Batman joke. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the character of Batman, we have Bruce Wayne, who by day is a very ordinary businessman, and then by night, he is a superhero. And lots of people in the DC Comics universe fail to understand how Bruce Wayne could also be Batman. And sometimes I feel like my career is a little bit like this. Until 2 months ago, my day job was very ordinary evolutionary biology. I thought about questions like, why are bird beaks so weird? And that monkey, why is it colored like that? But now I have this cool job where half of my time is now allocated to what I used to do only as side projects and my night job, which is thinking about human language diversity, human cultural diversity, and modeling that. However, I've found that a lot of people don't understand that the Catherine Sheard who does birds is also the Catherine Sheard who does humans. So part of what I'm doing today is try to explain to you why an evolutionary biologist can be helpful for studying human language and cultural evolution. Also setting the tone for this, I'm going to be bopping around between disciplines quite a bit. So if I lose you, don't worry, just wait a few minutes. I will probably circle back to something that you are more interested in. Okay, so what connects the biological side of my life and the linguistic side of my life is this idea of phylogenies. So very basic biology time, right? Like in biology, we have this thing called the speciation cycle, where you have a population of like whatever, say birds, and then geology happens. And a population gets split somehow. And over time, the population changes. And the question is, what happens if these two populations now were to come back in contact? And if they were to remain as separate genetic pools, as populations that are not interbreeding, we call them now two separate species. We can model this as a phylogenetic tree. So over time, we had the black species for a while, and then this split into the orange species and the blue species. You can also model languages like that, right? You have a population of speakers who generally agree that they are using approximately the same words and approximately the same grammatical features to discuss something. Over time, they split into separate speaker populations who are using maybe slightly different words and slightly different grammatical features. And then if you ask these speaker populations, hey, are you speaking different languages? Can you understand each other? They say, no, we aren't. We are now separate populations. And that process can also be modeled in a tree-like fashion. So that's this object from graph theory, fully connected acyclic graph. And the reason we might want to do that is there's a lot of really great mathematics that can be done on a tree that can't necessarily be done on some other representation of language history. I am hardly the first person to notice this. So in 1786, this gentleman here, Sir William Jones, gave the snappily titled Third Anniversary Discourse, where he made the observation that some European languages and some Indian languages seem to be related to each other in a hierarchical fashion. About 100 years later, Darwin actually cited this while trying to describe what biological evolution looks like. And we fast forward to 1994, where we have Ruth Mace, an anthropologist, and Mark Pagel, a biologist, who said, hey, comparative phylogenics, which was at that time a very new field, can also be of use in linguistics and anthropology. This thing that these biologists are doing with these math on trees can be done to study humans. And since 1994, and especially in the past sort of 5 to 10 years, there's been a real explosion of people using the tools developed in evolutionary biology to talk about human languages and other processes that we think might work like human languages. So that brings us to me, and that brings us to what I do. Now, if you want to do some science, you need 2 things. You need a topic and you need a study system. I tend to be the sort of person who picks a topic first and then finds a study system that matches that topic. But right now we're going to be mavericks. We're going to think about a study system first. And the reason we're doing this is probably familiar to many people in this room, which is that social science has a problem in that much of social science research is done on a very small sliver of the human population, on a very small sliver of human experience. Sometimes it is known by this acronym WEIRD, Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic, pardon the British spelling. But this, idea being that lots of research is done in English and other sort of majority colonial languages. Lots of research is done on, say, undergraduate psych majors at places like, the UK and the US. And that's great. English is a great language to study. Undergraduate psych majors are wonderful, if there are any in here. But that is probably not representative of the diversity of humans present today. Never mind if we want to try to model the history of humans at the scale of thousands of years. And in particular, certainly all of the calories I've consumed today, and probably the calories that you are consuming right now, I see you in the back eating pizza, come from agriculture, right? Our society is kind of built around intensive farming at the moment, and that's a relatively new thing. And we kind of have this sense that the way our society is structured around farming probably doesn't apply to other ways of gathering food, right? Probably doesn't apply to hunters, gatherers, and fisher people, but it's a little unclear. Some work has been done in languages and sort of this sense that are agricultural languages fundamentally different from hunter-gatherer languages? Turns out the answer is kind of no, they aren't. The languages by and large at this very broad scale work in similar ways. But this was a big question mark and is now a smaller question mark. And we certainly know less about any cultural or language cultural coevolution processes. So let's think about hunter-gatherers for a sec. Specifically, let's think about Australia. And I will say here, I'm not going to be showing any pictures of Aboriginal people. I'm also not going to be putting any specific Aboriginal words on the screen. So to the best of my knowledge, there are no relevant cultural taboos that I'm breaking. Okay. So if you've never thought about Australian linguistics before, at time of first European contact, there are probably maybe something like 400 languages being spoken in Australia, not counting Torres Strait Islanders. Those 400 languages probably maybe-ish fell into something like 28 language families plus a number of isolates. Most of that diversity, 3/4 of that diversity, belong to just a single language family. That is Pamanungan. Pamanungan originated probably about 6,000 years ago-ish. unclear. In the Gulf Plains region, so that's northwest, what we now know of as Queensland, it radiated out through the deserts, up into the far north, what we now know as Queensland, and by and large not into the northern, what we now know as Northern Territories, except for that little bit in Arnhem right there. It's a little unclear why that expansion happened. It was very rapid. Also, as far as we can tell, which is not very far, it was not accompanied by a genetic replacement, was maybe accompanied by some rock art, but there's a lot of question marks for what exactly was going on. But regardless, it is a very large expansion with a nice, beautiful dated phylogeny of traditionally hunter-gatherer languages, and therefore studying processes that work on this tree here can give us, a nice counterpoint, a nice difference from studying Indo-European or studying, your typical American undergrad psych major. So cool, we have study system. We're not only 10 minutes in, great. We now need a topic. So the kind of work I do, you can kind of study anything. So let's pick something cool. Let's pick kinship. Some of you know exactly what kinship is, and some of you are blinking confusedly at me or possibly down at your pizza. Kinship is the sense of how we talk about our families. So if we pretend the stock photo here is of sisters, in English, we have this nice word sister. So when we're talking about our siblings in English, we distinguish by gender. We don't distinguish by other things. One could distinguish by other things, right? So in some registers of Indonesian, the distinction is between elder sibling and younger sibling and not by gender. Or in Hawaiian, there's also a further distinguishment between the gender of the person who is speaking. And you may have noticed that this is very cisnormative, and that is true. The rest of this talk is going to be very heteronormative and is by no means going to capture the entire diversity of the human experience. Blame the 19th century Victorians. So when we see variation like this, when we see different ways of dividing up things that are very important to societies around the world, we can ask why. What's driving this variation in a system as important as families? Great. Study system, we have a topic. Let's do this. Okay. And let's think about grandparent terms specifically. So we have grandparents, very important for alloparental care, very important for cultural knowledge, also just in general, not really studied. In English, when we're talking about our grandparents, we distinguish our grandparents by gender. We, in general, in most dialects, have this word grandmother, grandfather. Doesn't matter which side of the family it's on. We don't have to talk about grandparents this way, right? There are 4 different people, 4 different words. We could do it that way. Or we could do something else. There's this sense of parallelness and crossness, which has to do with the lineages. So you have your parallel grandparents who are the tracing through the same gender lineage, so mother's mother and father's father. A very common thing to do worldwide is to have one word for father's mother, one word for the mother's father, and then the 2 same gender lineage, the parallel grandparents, we merge. You either totally followed that or you didn't. It's fine if you didn't. It's just like another system. In the Australian context, one could ask sort of how are we talking about grandparents and what's going on here? So this was a paper now that we published a few years ago with my collaborators, Claire Bowen, Ricker Dockham, and Fiona Jordan, where we looked at this variation across this large radiation of hunter-gatherer languages. So we have a map, looks like this. There's by and large 4 systems of grandparent terms. You can either just say that there's 4 and then like stop thinking, or you can know that like the most common one is all separate, so 4 people, 4 words. Next most common one is like English, so distinguishing by gender. The one after that is to merge the parallel grandparents, so same word for mother's mother and father's father. And then there's a few that will merge the cross grandparents, so mother's father, father's mother, and have separate words for the parallel grandparents. Just roll with it if you do not care about kinship diagrams. And we can look at this map and we can wonder if there's anything like spatially going on, and you can kind of see clusters. Like that's a cluster there, that's a cluster there. However, there's phylogeny on top of this. There's shared cultural history on top of this. That's an explanation of parallel cross. Okay, doesn't matter. Four systems. Four. Right, we have this culture or this cultural history of these languages. And by and large, you will have a similar system as the people who your language is more closely related to, with some exceptions. Pamanungan started with this green, all separate, and then occasionally switched to other things, and then sometimes from there switched yet again. So there are transitions happening at a fairly decent clip. And looking at this map, once you remove the phylogenetic history, there's actually no spatial autocorrelation on top of that. So they're not borrowing from their neighboring, at least not their neighboring Pamanungan languages. They're either innovating or borrowing from non-Pamanungan languages, which are much harder to model, so we didn't. We can use a program called multi-state and base traits to map out the transitions of which of these color dots go from which one. And I'll just tell you, there's kind of nothing going on here. Like you can stare at this and try to understand it, but you can just jump to the end that there's not. We go from the green, and green can either go to pink or purple, and then from there, sometimes that goes to brown. We never go directly from green to brown. That's cool and all, but that's actually not what we are expecting. We are expecting either there to be some section of the tree doing like a cross parallel thing and a separate section doing a gender thing. That's not true. Or we are expecting it to be like a number of term thing, because that's actually how siblings work. So we're expecting it to be maybe you go from 4 terms to 3 terms to 2 terms. That's not true at all. So there's something else going on. And also these arrows are different colors. They're happening at different rates, different probabilities. And the next question to ask is why? What's driving these transitions, especially because this diagram looks kind of weird. Depending on how much exposure you've had to like first year anthropology, you may think you know the answer at this point, because there was a belief in the 19th century and then again in the 1940s that these sort of kinship systems would correlate very strongly with social practice around marriage. In the last 10 years or so, this has kind of turned into a question mark, because it turns out you can go back to these data sets from the 1940s. You can add better data to that. You can also do the statistics properly. And then you can find out this isn't as universal a process as George Peter Murdoch thought it was. There are some correlations between practices around marriage and the way we talk about our families, but they're very localized. It's complicated. So how complicated is it in Australia? Turns out not that complicated at all. There's just no correlation. Like these figures suck because there's like nothing going on here. In as much as we understand traditional practices around marriage in these communities, which I should say is not very far, that's not correlating to the way they're talking about their grandparents. So what is going on? Another idea is that kinship systems are themselves systems, so therefore not changing independently. Anthropologists tend to be really obsessed with cross cousins, particularly for sort of this marriage thing, and like the way we talk about our cross cousins relates to maybe the way whether or not we're allowed to marry our cross cousins. Again, that may or may not be true. But there's sort of this idea that like if there's a big change in how we talk about our cross cousins, that means change cascading across the whole kinship system. That's turned out not true in Pamanungan. So I'm not even gonna bother to put a figure up. However, grandparents talk about their grandchildren, surprise, surprise. And we do also see changes in the words and systems for grandchildren, and those will map pretty closely to changes for grandparents. And in fact, these changes are happening so fast that we can't capture any sort of order on a phylogenetic scale. So at the scale of 6,000 years, they're happening basically at the same time. So that's neat. We have solved grandparents. I'm going to pause and drink water. Sorry. Cool. But I told you that like kinship was neat. I'm not trying to tell you the grandparents are neat. I'm trying to tell you that talking about your family is cool. So let's zoom out a little bit. Where do we go from here? Again, depending on how much exposure you've had to first year anthropology, you may think that the question, how many kinship systems are there, is an interesting question, because there is this very strong belief that there are 6 kinship systems and 6 kinship systems only. This comes from, again, sort of like the Victorians, going around and seeing repetition in the way we classify members of our family, and then trying to put that repetition into a small number of categories, because small numbers of categories are easy to analyze, and also because small numbers of categories would be kind of cool. Like if there's only like 6 possible behaviors that we're seeing again and again around the world, like that would be so neat. Yeah, so it comes from George Peter Murdoch. He kind of knew at the time that this was false, and certainly anyone these days who is still using this sort of data knows that it's false. I took this figure from this paper because it's beautiful. No shade to these authors at all; they know exactly what they're doing. But this just isn't true. Like there certainly is repetition in the kinship system around the world. It does not map beautifully to exactly 6 systems. Okay, certainly more than 6. What about this number? So if you think that there are only 24 socially salient members of your family, the combinatorial theoretical maximum is the 24th Bell number, which is this number here. Among other things, there's only 7,000 extant languages in the world, so it's not that, right? But so there's some sort of very big theoretical limit. There's some sort of very small number that languages are actually innovating in. And it would be useful to understand what languages are in fact doing if it's not 6. There are bounds somewhere. We just don't know where those bounds are. So one way to address this is to start doing really, really good anthropology. So last year, Ian Keen in Current Anthropology published a very, very long paper where he went through Australian languages, both Pamanungan and non-Pamanungan, trying to classify them in a way that makes a lot of sense in the Australian context. Did a fantastic job, invited commentaries on it. Fiona Jordan and I wrote one of them. Where we pointed out that what Ian Keen did was very strongly phylogenetic. This is a little hard to see. I am sorry. It's beautiful on my screen. But basically what happens is there are 6 categories. You don't care what they are. But if you think about it in a historical hierarchical context, basically Pamanungan started out as blue. A handful of times it switched to another color, and then it just stayed there. Still very interesting anthropologically. If we can figure out what was happening, like in this branch right here, when that switch right there from blue to green, like that's really neat. How do communities negotiate that? I don't know, but it's cool. But this is also a dead end for people like me. Like this is not enough for someone who does phylogenetic comparative methods to analyze. So we've got to do something else. So that brings us to KinBank. So a few months ago, a very large team from the US, Germany, Australia, Finland, Brazil, and the US published a database of 1,200 languages kin terms. So not systems, but the terms themselves that we use to talk about different categories of aunts and uncles and cousins and great-grandparents and so on and so forth. There's a website if you just want to look at pretty colors and look at pretty maps, or all of the data is on GitHub if you want to play with it yourself. I will say that KinBank is very much a work in progress. I said 1,200. 1,200 does not equal 7,000. And in particular, we are in no way claiming that this is representative. It was driven largely by the academic interests of the people contributing data. So really great for like Australian and Austronesian, really poor for some other aspects of the human experience, including, by the way, signed languages. But lots of good Australian data in there, in part because Claire Bowen and I contributed a lot of data. So let's think about systems in a different way. Let's take the terms themselves and try to find systems from the terms. So these are the 76 languages for which Claire and I were able to get a full or full-ish kinship term inventory. You may remember I said there was like 300 Pamanungan languages and we could only get data for 76. Possibly that's because I live in the UK and not Australia, but a lot of that is also that a cultural genocide happened. It happened very fast. We just don't have records for a lot of these languages. But for the ones that we do have a record of, we then went through each of these categories, these culturally relevant categories of people in your family, and then we devised questions that perfectly describe the variation in these 76 languages. So not the variation around the world, but just these 76 languages, questions like, okay, these siblings, does this language distinguish siblings by gender? Yes, no. Is there a difference in elder sister versus younger sister? Yes, no. You get a lovely grid that looks like this, nice sort of binary matrix, yes, no. And then you have to turn this into data that can actually be analyzed. And this is where paleontology comes in. So paleontologists are really, really, really good at taking a matrix of binary data, especially matrix with missing data, and turning it into continuous data that can be plugged into modern phylogenetic comparative methods. We used CLADIS, which is Graham Lloyd's program. There are other options to first fill in all these holes using phylogenetic imputation, and then turn these zeros and ones into a coordinate system. So this is a multi-dimensional kinship space that has described what Pamanungan has done with kinship. So not things that they haven't done, but like what combinations of things they could do. So languages that are close together in this multi-dimensional coordinate space have very similar systems, and languages that are far apart have different systems. The first two dimensions look like this. That outlier, by the way, is, I think, the data problem, but that's very hard to prove because it's not a language we can soak it anymore. So we leave it in there, but we remain suspicious. You can then do things like play connects the dots. So this is, clustering algorithm. You can choose a different one if you want. The answer that I'm going to tell you on the next slide will in fact be the same. And you can say, okay, are there clusters of different languages in different bits of kinship space? Are there languages doing similar things in kinship space? And look, you can play connect the dots all you want. That doesn't make it meaningful. You can look if this actually explains the variation above chance and above phylogenetic history, and it just straight up does not. So we can't find typologies this way. We will not be undeterred. We will not be deterred. That's how English works. Okay. Another thing that we could look for is holes in the kinship space. So remember, this is a space of things that languages have done, but it's possible that combinations of these things are forbidden. It's possible that, yes, you can talk about your cousins this way, and you can talk about your grandparents this way, but doing both of those things is either cognitively too complicated or socially doesn't make sense for sort of whatever is driving these variation, or something's going on that means we go here in space or here in space, but not here in space. So instead of playing connect the dots with colored pencils, we now can play connect the dots with a single color. We model the fact that A, we don't have a perfect sense of phylogenetic history, and B, that evolution is kind of wibbly wobbly. And we look for holes, we look for gaps in this green space using Ben Blonder's hypervolume method. And there just kind of aren't gaps. Of this giant kinship space, only 4% of the volume could conceivably be called a hole. I mean, like 4% is not zero, but that's not indicating that there's like these giant gaps of things that are just like cognitively or socially forbidden. Instead, it looks like they're kind of innovating and being very creative with these kinship words. again, we will not be deterred. We can then think about, okay, even if this giant kinship space is being occupied relatively uniformly, maybe there's something determining why a language is going over here rather than going over there. So we go back to our friend George Peter Murdoch, and we go back to the fact that kinship studies at the macroevolutionary scale for the past 15 years have just been a bunch of giant question marks. And we say, okay, does your position in this space relate to community marriage practice? So endogamy versus exogamy. Yes. Yes, it does. We finally have a like non-negative answer. So these blobs are not the most convincing, but yes, your occupation of where you are in kinship space does in fact relate to your community marriage practice. We can ask the same question with postmarital residency. So that's norms about where a newly married couple lives with the wife's family, their husband's family. Not related at all. No blobs on this. And then we can do more methods. Right. We can think back to the grandparents, and we can think about the fact that anthropologists really like cross cousins, and there's a sense that everything should be changing with the cross cousins. Grandparents weren't, but grandparents were changing with grandchildren. So maybe there's this other bits of the kinship system that are changing with each other or very much not changing with each other. So we can just run a whole bunch of correlations with these categories. If you run the correlations in a very, very naive way, some pop out, still not a lot. And then you run in a smaller way and you get 21 models and one p less than 0.05. This is an XKCD cartoon. There's nothing going on here. So whatever kinship systems are doing, they aren't changing everything at the same time. They'll change one little bit and not the other bit over there. Okay. So let's think about something else. Let's think about maybe like speeds of change. And let's think about how fast the lineages themselves are exploring space. And let's think about sort of the history over the past 6,000 years or so. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look for evidence that over the past 6,000 years, Pamanungen at some point got really excited and started changing their kinship systems a lot, or decided to not do that and just like keep their kinship systems very stable for a while. This happens all the time in biological evolution. A sort of early burst model. What that would mean in language evolution is a little less clear, but then again, this is a language family that marched across Australia and we don't know why. So like anything's possible. This is a disparity through time plot. This black thing is the line of disparity. If it were going completely at random, no changes in speed at all, it would be a perfect straight line. If it were going through an early burst, so if things were changing really fast at the beginning and then slowing down, it would be a happy face parabola, so a positive first derivative. And if things were changing really rapidly at the end, and not so much in the beginning, sad face parabola, negative second derivative. This is a line. This is statistically, this black thing is indistinguishable from a line. We have a few languages that say that there was a lot of innovation going on at a few versions of the Pamanungen phylogeny thinks that there's a lot of innovations in the beginning, but that is just based on where we think the branches might have been, and there's some uncertainty there. By and large, that reconstruction probably isn't true. So there was no wave of everyone getting really excited about kinship in Australia over the past 6,000 years. And then finally, we could think about maybe it's not the whole continent, but maybe it's just little bits of the phylogeny that might get very excited about kinship. It might be that like one region of Australia just decided to innovate for some language contact reason or environmental reason, or who knows. Reason that there's not even a figure is because this is just false. So I ran it through base traits variable rates model. And this is literally the first time in my life that variable rates told me no. This is single rate Brownian motion. Very, very strongly, it is nothing else. I've probably lost a lot of you guys by here. So I'm going to take a sec and explain what the heck I just said. Okay. So Brownian motion is this model originally used to describe the movement of pollen grains floating on water. I explained it to my student as a drunk guy looking for his house keys. It is a memoryless model where the distribution of where the agent has gone is proportional only to the amount of time since you've checked in with them. Basically just like going off in a random direction, kinda anywhere. Brownian motion describes mammalian body mass evolution really well. Not the cetaceans, but everything else. It also makes it really easy to do calculus. You can do calculus on Brownian motion very, very easily in a way that's much harder to do on other types of stochastic processes. So it's used to describe evolution a whole lot. It's also used in economics and physics and just all sorts of other fields. It is mathematically very simple. We know that biological evolution does not even remotely work like Brownian motion. We also know that language evolution probably doesn't work that way because languages probably don't change at random. Like there's probably, as I said, cognitive reasons for us to have one kinship system and not like something else going on. That being said, what I just showed you through like 6 different methods was that whatever Pomenungen is doing with kinship, it is very, very strongly Brownian. They're just kind of like exploring and innovating and borrowing at a very slow and steady rate and not doing anything statistically unexpected. So what is going on here? If it's not some like really fancy evolutionary biology methods, what is happening? I haven't showed you a map yet, and there's a very specific reason for this. This is the first and most important variation of scores in the kinship system. So colors that are more similar means that their kinship systems are more similar. But this actually works multidimensionally. You just can't plot multiple dimensions on PowerPoint. So if there were spatial autocorrelation here, we would see clusters of the same color above and beyond whatever is going on phylogenetically. There's no reason you'd have the Pomenungen phylogeny in your head, so you'll just have to believe me that there is spatial clustering here. However, these languages are not borrowing from their nearest neighbors. Instead, there is very strong correlation between these kinship system scores and the environments that they're living in. So temperature and precipitation and also seasonality and just all bunch of other stuff very strongly predict how you talk about your family. Okay, that's weird. The most sensible interpretation of this is that actually people are borrowing, but they're borrowing from cultures that live in environments like them. So you are a person of the desert, you talk to, trade with, marry with other people from the desert, and you kind of don't interact with the people from the sea, even if they're just over there. This seems plausible. It's going to be a little hard to verify that with sort of traditional anthropogenic data, because again, there is a very large cultural genocide, lots of movement of people. It's unclear. And there's a question. Amazing, please. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that second one. Amazing. I'm going to repeat the question for the folks on Zoom and also to make sure I understood what you asked. The first part of the question was, with these phylogenies, is it just purely modeled based on extant data, or am I validating this with some sort of data about where these communities were actually living, what they were doing? Very much this is just a model based on extant data. Very little is known about the Australian archaeological record. And then the second part of the question was, how do I separate these processes? So in this case, I am separating out the phylogenetic history first. This is not necessarily how languages work, right? Like you're probably also borrowing from the people that you are closely related to. I am lumping them together as the same process. So I'm assuming that there has been this tree-like process, which is probably a parallel for speciation and also a little bit model for borrowing. But in as much as it is tree-like in a sort of graph theory sense, we're taking that away first. Then that was an exciting noise. I wonder what that means. Then the second thing that I'm asking here is there correlation above and beyond that with the people that they live near? And then there's like 5 different ways I try to model that. So things like, are they borrowing from their nearest neighbor? Are they borrowing from the 3 nearest neighbor? Is there correlation between the distance between where they live and what the systems are? All of which have their flaws, right? Like this is Australia is pretty big. There probably is after a point, like it's literally 0. Like it doesn't matter if you're half a continent away or full continent away, you're not in contact. But given that we don't know much about sort of traditional contact between these groups, that's sort of the best we can do. And then it's above and beyond that there is some sort of environmental signature. And are people interacting with each other according to these sort of like environmental gradients of similarity that I'm pretty sure is unknown, or at least I don't have any data on that. Does that answer your question? Amazing. Okay. Yeah, so there are these very strong horizontal processes shaping kinship space that are very strongly related to the environment. That is cool and weird and different. And says something really cool about kinship evolution that suddenly someone like me can no longer answer, right? Like I've thrown a bunch of cool paleontological and evolutionary biology methods at you, and then suddenly we've hit a wall and now we need to talk to actual anthropologists and actual linguists. So, okay, that was, I took some time answering that question, basically summarizing what I just said. All of this was actually a search for kinship typologies in Pomenungan, and we very strongly did not find any. It is being structured a little bit by social variables, also by environmental variables. That probably means something cool. And this is an example of the sorts of things that someone like me can add into the mix when we're thinking about kinship. What does it mean? Question mark. This is not my concluding slide. I still have a few more slides, but I will, at this point, thank my 2 collaborators on the various Australian projects that I talked about, because I'm going to shift gears for my last few minutes. And that is to talk about where do we go from here, right? So I'm trying to convince you the macroevolutionary studies are cool and useful, and phylogenies are cool and useful. But in kinship especially, I very strongly think that there needs to be more dialogue with other folks who are studying kinship. So especially the child development folks and the language contact folks who can say what is actually happening on the scale of years rather than the scale of hundreds of years that I study. So in part because of that, and in part because of this new fellowship that I just got, I'm kind of leaving kinship aside now, and to circle back to the Batman theme, where I'm personally going from here in my career is thinking about birds. So thinking about linguistic ethno-ornithology, thinking about how people talk about birds around the world, and thinking about how cultural evolution can inform conservation efforts to protect the birds that I love, and hopefully you love too. And on that note, if you want to live next to a very, very cold beach in Scotland, and if you like birds and people, I'm going to be recruiting actually up to 4 PhD students next year. So you're a master's student or an undergrad, come talk to me, or tell the master's students and undergrads that you work with. Alternatively, if you've been asleep for my whole talk and only woke up when I talked about birds and mammals and phylogenetic methods, I am also recruiting for things that have nothing to do with cultural evolution, so you can come talk to me about that too. Okay, this is actually my acknowledgement slides. Thank you folks so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I've had an amazing day so far. I presented a lot of work with tremendous co-authors, and thank you for your attention.
Did you, all the things you're presenting, did you notice any like explosive moments where there was like rapid evolution of like kinship?
Yeah, I didn't notice any. I mean, other than a few cases like, let me back up. A phylogeny isn't typically just one phylogeny, it's typically a whole bunch of phylogenies because we aren't actually sure what the history of these languages were. So we make a bunch of our best guesses, and then any analysis we do, we loop over a whole bunch of them and take the average. There are some cases where if you just look at one of our possible guesses, then there's like interesting kind of explosions or unusual things that said, okay, if this branch is actually over here instead of over here, then the kinship system did something really neat. That was, if you remember the graph with the line, and there's a few things that went like that. That's that case there. I did look into those individually, and I couldn't find anything that seemed particularly meaningful for the system. By and large, it seemed to me, and also Declare, who knows everything about Australia, that this was just sort of like a statistical artifact, and that probably the majority answer seemed reasonable given what's understood about the anthropology of these systems. That's not to say that it's not there. And again, I will say that this is based on this last bit was based on only 76 languages worth of data. So there's a whole 224 other languages that we aren't representing. And there's also probably some sort of bias geographically, socially, having to do with European contact in what is still being spoken today, and also who was and wasn't recorded as these languages were no longer being spoken. So that was a long and rambling answer, but hope that got it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is sort of why I think that there's a brick wall in people like me. So in Kinbank, if there was variation, we dealt with it in kind of different ways depending on who it was that was collecting the data. So the Australian data, because for many of these, there's no way to validate it, we mostly put everything in a few cases where there's still a community of living speakers, we were able to validate with living speakers and ask them what they were currently doing. We also were very careful where possible to stick dates and any dialect information, any regional information on there. So like, I think it's our Japanese data. A lot of Japanese speakers are like, this is very strange. And like, no, it's Japanese data from 150 years ago. And not the Japanese that's being spoken today. So yeah, the way people navigate, like especially multilingual communities, like are you using the kinship terms of your mother's side of the family? Are you using the kinship terms of your father's side of the family, of the majority language, of the language you speak at home? What if you speak multiple languages at home? This is all very, very interesting to me, and also something that's very hard to scale to this type of toolkit. So this is a call to those of you who do actual anthropology to study kinship. It's neat. Amazing. Please. Yeah, no, that's an amazing question. I'm going to go back to a phylogeny. Hello, sorry. Sorry. This is gonna, nope, we are committed now. Here we go. This will do. Okay. Oh, sorry. Repeating the question for those on Zoom. The question for those on Zoom was about contact very early on with the languages that were being spoken sort of before and during the Pamanungan expansion. Right. So most of the reconstructions of system by system are look kind of like this. This happens to be Ian Keen's data, but like if you remember my grandparent tree, it also looked like this. So that the Pomonungan history is very, very strongly in most cases just single traits. Like here, everything is blue. Like the first 3,000 years of the Pomonungan expansion, they were all in this case using the same kinship system, in the grandparent case using the same grandparent system. So probably by the time that 3,000 years were over, a lot of the replacement had already been done in everywhere sort of except the Northern Territory. And so there's no evidence that during that expansion, they were incorporating local kinship systems. You would think that they would be, because you do see this a lot in language contacts. You'll see, I don't know if any of you speak like Yiddish at home, but even sort of like third or fourth generation away from that, there'll still be folks using Yiddish kinship terms, even if that's the only Yiddish that they still use. However, other alternatives might be the non-Pomonungan languages remaining in sort of Northern Australia. There's a less data on that. We tried to, in the Arnhem languages, figure out like who was talking to who and who was nearest with who and who's marrying into who and what might be going on there. And it's not that the Arnhem languages, in terms of kinship specifically, are doing anything different. In terms of like ethnobiological systems, there is a lot more swapping and contact there. There's trade related words. They are certainly borrowing heavily and have been doing so for a long time, but kinship systems, even into communities where they've been, as near as we can tell, marrying into for a very long time, there's not the level of horizontal transmission that one might expect to see. That being said, the data is patchy, so it was honestly probably going on, and we just can't capture it with methods like this. Amazing, thank you, Zoom. Yeah, I wish I knew. There is a very small amount of data, like vanishingly small, maybe a dozen communities where we have some sort of sense of like where exactly their food was coming from. So how much of it was fishing, and there is some sort of low level agriculture and how much they were actually moving around, and estimates like that from Binford's hunter gatherer encyclopedia thing. It has a better citation, sorry. I've tried. Think the sample size is too small. Like I didn't find anything meaningful, and at that point it's hard to tell if that's statistical power or if there's nothing meaningful to be found there. Not a satisfying answer, person on Zoom, I'm sorry, but that is exactly the question to be asking. I just don't know.
Thank you.
Amazing, thank you.
More about the grandparent thing where the grandparents and the what did you fill in something?
I did go over it quite fast. Yeah, so there are right, that you can trace your grandchildren through in multiple ways. You can trace your grandchildren, right, like through your daughters, through your sons. Is it like elder son versus younger son? Like there are it's not just grandson granddaughter the way it is in English. You can imagine several different ways of doing that. In Australia, in a lot of these languages, there's a sort of moiety symbol system on top of this. So in addition to the lineage of your family, you'll also be classified into another grouping within your band, clan, group, and often the ways that you will talk, often but not always, the ways that you'll talk about your grandchildren will actually match the traditional moiety classifications. Obviously, ideal marriage patterns do not always match what actually happens, so these won't be perfect. And I actually honestly don't know very much about the tension between what happens when the way you should speak to your grandchild is not, according to society's perfect rules, does not match the way you actually trace descendancy to that grandchild. We spent a little bit of time trying to then take this and match that to what was going on with the grandparents, and that kind of didn't work. So we can understand the social setting for the grandchildren terms sort of ish, maybe. And we can know that the grandchildren, if a society is going to change the way it talks about their grandchildren, they're also going to change the way they talk about their grandparents at about the same time. But it's not like the grandchildren or grandparent terms exactly match the sort of other ways of tracing lineage and descent and membership within the group. We also, like, part of the reason we were even testing sort of exogamy is we were thinking about in groups where there's a very strong norm of marrying outside of your linguistic group. There's often typically a norm that it will be sort of one side of the lineage is that marries out. So like, a daughter would be a son, one, something like that. And so it might be something that like, well, your mother's mother will never belong to your moiety system, so you'd have a separate word for her. Didn't find evidence of that. Although again, the data is not great, so it's probably there. We probably missed it. Also, there's no reason to think that like, the classification system in this bit of the continent is the same as the system in this other bit of the continent, right? Like, there's probably a lot of overgeneralization that went on into my thinking about that. Did that answer your question? Amazing.
So in the face science, you may have, sorry if you kind of said this, but
I've hit the part of the day where I'm rambling. I'm really sorry.
So is it the case then that the terms for grandchildren, the tendency, the structure of those terms to map on to the structure of the term grandparent? So you have this different kinds of terms, right, for grandparent. Is it kind of parallel with the term used for grandchildren, or is it simply that this relationship between? Does that make sense?
Is that they change at the same time?
It's just the timing, not the case that, for example, if you're talking about if your mother's mother descent, father descent, have a kind of parallel relationship with the grandchildren.
Yeah, you would think that. And I think it does in fact correlate like slightly above chance, but more it's that if you're changing the way that one is happening, you're changing the way that the other is happening, but they may not, right? The vector arrows may not go in the same direction, which is cool and interesting, and I can't explain it. Amazing, thank you.